Again, thank you so much for joining us today for this very important, albeit difficult conversation about no space for racism, and then specifically how you as member firms of the Diversity Project and some of our allies, firms and partners can deepen and develop community within your own organizations. When the racially inspired riots happened in Britain at the start of August, several people contacted me and said, oh, the Diversity Project should put out a statement condemning the violence. And of course, along with everybody else, I think, was horrified by what had happened, and in particular, how it might affect people from the communities that were being targeted. But I also was reluctant just to put out some form of grandstanding statement and to kind of put out a statement without actually doing anything. And over the ensuing weeks, we had a number of firms and members contact us and say, could you help us with communications around these issues? Could you help us with helping our employees, some of whom feel very threatened and concerned about what's happened and who feel personally targeted or unsure about how to handle these issues? Can you help us help them? So today's webinar is a starting point for that. It's not going to be one and done in one webinar, but we hope that by talking about some of the lived experiences some people at our firms have experienced, but also having some expert views in our second panel from those who spend time, who work with the communities affected, but also who've been spending time helping firms deal with these types of issues. We hope that we will be setting the ball rolling, as it were, and afterwards the Diversity Project will be issuing, if not a communique, that sounds very grand again, but some form of guidance to help firms. But also we would expect this to be very much a living and breathing document, and something where we would welcome case studies and examples being shared, again, in the interest that we can all help to support each other and those colleagues who feel undermined or threatened by what is happening, and I'm afraid might continue to happen. We also are very much supportive of some work that one of our partner organizations, Reboot, which is a group of professionals within the investment industry who are determined to stamp out racism. And they have put out a call for a survey a couple of weeks ago. They've had 260 responses to that survey, and it was specifically around reactions to the riots in the UK. They haven't yet published the results of the survey. That will come out next week, but Noreen Middleshah, who some of you might know, who runs Reboot and founded it, she has shared with me the findings and is happy for me to share the headlines with you today. Basically, I'd asked professionals in the financial industry to fill out this survey, and 260 adults working in the UK financial services industry did so. The good news was that the majority said that their employer had taken action in response to the riots across the UK. Just over half said that their company has released an internal statement of support, and a similar number said that their company had provided more flexibility for people to work from home or to travel to and from work at different times. So that was encouraging. However, many of those who filled out the survey said that they felt this reaction felt forced and knee-jerk, and their real criticism was that there tended to be an immediate reaction and then all communication stopped after a week or so. And in short, employees are more dissatisfied than satisfied with how their employers have responded to the riots, even if they recognise it's with good intentions, and even more so, somewhat unhappy with the industry as a whole. And many in particular cited the events of 4 years ago around George Floyd's murder, and then the whole Black Lives Matter movement's campaign on race in the workplace, that they felt that many organisations, again, said very big things at the time, again, were all appalled by what had happened, but didn't follow through, and that there'd been very little progress or change in the last 4 years to make material changes. And of course, as you might expect, but just to clarify, those who are ethnic minorities felt much more likely to feel this way than their white contemporaries or colleagues. So perhaps no surprises there, but I think important to inform our conversation today. We're going to have 2 sessions within the webinar today, and I hope that you find both really informative and interesting, and as I say, sort of kicking the ball rolling, but not sort of pretending that we will solve life, universe and everything today. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. We had already provided that ahead, so if people had wanted to submit anonymous questions or have those tabled in advance, I know some of you have done that, and thank you. But there will be an opportunity to ask questions in the chat as we go through this. Well, at any stage you can ask them, but they will be addressed at the end of the second panel. The first panel is three gentlemen who have kindly volunteered. I hope they don't feel pressed going by me, to share their lived experiences, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. And we have someone who is Muslim, someone who is Jewish, and someone who is Black, and they're going to talk about their different experiences, particularly over the recent past, but also longer term, and also talk about the positive things that they've seen happen that have helped. And then we'll move on to a panel which Lucas Klein, who's head of EMEA and APAC equities at Janus Henderson Investors, is going to moderate. Thank you in advance, Lucas, for stepping forward to do that. And this is a group of experts who, work, as I said earlier, work with companies to help them to overcome the challenges that are intrinsic to these issues, and to help their colleagues feel more supported and feel more secure.
So I'm Lucas Klein. I'm the head of equities for EMEA and Asia Pacific for Janus Henderson. I'm also the executive sponsor for our UK-based Black Professional Network. I did just want to highlight for folks on the call, September is Sickle Cell Awareness Month, and I wanted to recognize our Black Professional Network, who along with several other employee resource groups put on a couple of fantastic events yesterday to educate about sickle cell, the importance of giving blood, and actually registered people to give blood. So at Janus Henderson, we believe diversity improves results. And personally, like many of you on this call, I'm a strong believer in creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive asset management industry. How we respond to crises, whether internal or external, will have an impact on our ability to attract, retain, develop, and motivate diverse talent. Now, I've got the easy job on this panel. I just have to ask a few questions and then get out of the way of our fantastic panelists. Many diversity project member organizations have sent in questions in advance, and we want to thank you for that. We'll have the panelists address some of those questions, and then we'll try and leave some time to solicit real-time questions from the audience as well. So at any point, if you have questions, you're welcome to submit them via the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll be monitoring those throughout the panel. We may ask answer some directly, and then again, we'll do our best to turn those over to the panelists. Now, I'll introduce the panelists. It's a privilege. So first, Fudia Smart is a partner at Spencer West LLP with 20 years of experience as a solicitor and a specialist in every stage of the employment life cycle. Fudia advises employers and employees on topics like bullying, harassment, unfair and wrongful dismissal, discrimination, and whistleblowing. So welcome, Fudia. Rachel Vecht. Rachel founded Educating Matters in 2001, working with global organizations to address a vast array of DEI topics. Rachel's personal expertise relates to supporting working parents and carers. Over the past year, she's worked with many sectors on understanding anti-Semitism and the lived experience of Jewish people in the workplace. Welcome, Rachel. Dr. Muna Abdi. She's an author, researcher, and the founder of MA Consultancy. She's contributed to literature on the topics of race and racism, decolonization, and African diasporic studies. Her work with organization begins with literacy to create a shared language that's clear, focused, and action-oriented. Welcome, Dr. Muna. And last but not least, Dr. Shafi Fazaladdin. Dr. Shafi is a solicitor, author, and academic, and he's the founder of the Mediation Service, which specializes in promoting a positive workplace culture and managing conflicts at work. He has 14 years experience working as a senior lawyer in financial services and also leading an employee network at Goldman Sachs. So we're thrilled to welcome these four distinguished panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, as Helena stated, the catalyst for this panel was what we heard from many firms, which is confusion about how this particular situation in the UK escalated. We heard the results that Helena quoted from the survey earlier, that more often than not, employees were dissatisfied with firms' responses and the support that was made available. So Fadia, I'd like to start with you, please. Could you please give our listeners an overview of the social context for the race riots and the general unrest in the UK, and why the organizational response had such a profound effect?
Thank you, Lucas. I mean, it's a multifaceted question there. What were the causes of the race riots? As we know, immigration has been a big topic of discussion over the last few years, Brexit notwithstanding. And there is a general sense of the training that I do when I go into organization. I'm getting apathy from some people, feeling that since George Floyd, all we're doing is talking about DEI, and it's, you know, it's taking over more important things from housing, social care to social mobility and job opportunity. I'm also finding, other than just apathy, actual disdain for DEI. The fact that the term DEI is now becoming a contentious term is the same way that woke has gone through that trajectory says a lot. So I also think that is a fundamental issue. And then there's a real sense of awkwardness. So in addition to being a lawyer, I go into mostly regulated firms, whether it be finance, accounting, or law, and I do training on things such as DEI, allyship, intersectionality. And when I do that training, what I'm getting a lot now, people saying, I'm too scared to talk about these issues. So I know these things are happening, but I'm so fearful of saying the wrong thing and being cancelled or castigated for saying the wrong thing. And this all creates a melting point of distrust, concern, apathy, and anger, which I think boiled over somewhat into the race riot. So I wasn't that surprised by it, if I be honest. But even though I wasn't that surprised by it, I interestingly had a conversation with someone who said, I think the right had nothing to do with race at all. Now, people are allowed to raise concerns about immigration. And that was just a few people being stupid because during the summer, people are, you know, have their time on their hands. Now, whether or not I agree with that thought process, it goes to show that some people, despite there being reports of people of colour, Black and Muslims in particular, being, you know, sought down the streets and being chased, people said, I don't think that's a matter of race. So when you combine the fact that even when we have a situation, which to me on the face of it, very clearly related to race, people are saying, no, we're going too far, making everything about race, that, you know, we're ending up in a situation where we can't even call a thing anymore without that being further evidence of us trying to push a DEI agenda. Now, where does this fit with the general flow of where things are going? I thought about this long and hard this morning, and I was thinking yesterday night, I was like, I would give industry, UK businesses a C+. And then I thought maybe that was a bit too harsh. And I think particularly for asset management, I'd give it a B-. And the reason I say that is a lot of good work has been done. As we heard from the last panel, we have organizations having far greater affinity groups. They have DEI committees. When I became a lawyer, DEI wasn't even a term in existence. It wasn't something that was talked about, even though I've always been a unicorn of 1 or 2 Black lawyers, despite having lived in London my whole life, where I make up 13.5% of the population. So if we have Black lawyers at the same level around the country in London, how more are we less represented outside of London, where we are in greater numbers? So I think in giving that grade, the issue is that I feel that we are now at the adolescence phase of the DEI journey. And if you've ever dealt with an adolescent, or you remember your teen years, you remember how painful and difficult that was. We had the explosion of DEI committees being set up following the George Floyd's murder. But that can only take you so far. People are getting tired by the fact that change hasn't happened overnight, which is partly causing the apathy. Those who are greatly affected by the issues are also feeling disgruntled and disenfranchised because the rate of change hasn't been at the rate that they wanted. And I feel now is the time to dig in, as opposed to say, maybe we've tried it and we need to stop using DEI as a terminology. I think now is the time to say, we need to continue educating. We need leaders to lead from the front, to show that vulnerability, I thought Faisal's conversation with his manager was so important and sets a great example of what we need organizations to be doing. I also loved Faisal's comment about EQ and the need for soft skills, which those of us who've ever dealt with somebody who's poor in soft skills, we know they are anything but soft. This is where the rubber hits the road. It's not enough to acknowledge that we have a diversity issue or to set up committees. We need to be asking people in real time, how is this affecting? We need to be willing to say, I don't know the answer. And I agreed with Stephen, but the only kind of additional point I would add, it's important to be curious, but we also need to educate ourselves first. We cannot expect other people or those from minoritized groups to do all the heavy lifting. We need to do what we can and then come with humility and grace, ask questions. I do think there is more that the law could do to make organizations take a greater stand. I think we need ethnicity pay gap reporting, and that should be compulsory for most organizations. But when I look at where asset management as an industry is, it is making great inroads, but of course, there's a lot of work to do. But the main point I would like to drive home, it's progress over perfection. And so when we are judging, when we're giving ourselves a scorecard, we have to have some sympathy for the fact that for some people, this will be their first time grappling with issues of race. If you're from a minoritized group, you start dealing with this from childhood. But for people who are from the majority group, having to learn a lot of these things in real time is difficult. And that's why we need to have that grace and understanding, but we need to be always working towards an upward trajectory.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I mean, you made a couple of, important points there around even the term DEI being stigmatized, or, the term woke being stigmatized. I think broadly, the words we use matter when we talk about race and racism, power and privilege. Specific language has the ability to help us understand who's impacted, how they're impacted, and what an organization can do to support employees at a time of crisis. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Muna and Rachel. You're both experts who run your own racial equity and DEI consultancies. Could you please help us define key terms such as Islamophobia, privilege, and anti-Semitism, just so we're all on the same page, and also help us understand what the impact might be of not being specific in our language? So maybe we'll start with Dr. Muna, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lucas. I think first and foremost, it's important to say that when language is unclear or inaccurate, it leads to inaction, because those terms are considered to be abstract, and it's hard for people to think about how that language can then be translated into action. So if we are, as an organization, thinking about how we can bring people together as a community with a shared language, it's really important to have clear understandings of what those terms are. The term that I'm going to start with, Lucas, is privilege. And I'm going to start with privilege because it's the term that often in spaces evokes a lot of defensiveness and emotional responses, because there's a connotation of unearned privileges that, or unearned benefits that sit with the individual. And it's really important for us when we're talking about structures and systems that we depersonalize this. So the language that we use within my organization as a starting point is structurally embedded advantage. And we talk about that alongside the language of intersecting identities, because it's really important for us to understand how all of us have multifaceted identities. We have gender, religion, race, sexuality, so on and so forth. And all of those identities are experienced concurrently at the same time to give us a unique experience. And that means that there are structures that are enabled in every organization, in every system that we navigate. That means that a part of our identity is advantaged and another part of our identity may be disadvantaged in those spaces. And in understanding that, people will be able to grasp that when we talk about structurally embedded advantage and we talk about an outcome of that being a set of privileges, that every single one of us has sets of privileges. Those privileges might be different, but it's important that we understand that privilege is an outcome of structurally embedded advantage. It's not something that sits with the individual. It's not something that an individual has choice over and is often unconscious, but it is a tool that we can utilize in an empowering way. So it's not a rod to punish somebody and say you are privileged in some way, but a way for us to reflect and hold ourselves in a position where we can be allies and think about how we can navigate spaces with ease in certain contexts that others may not be able to, and how we utilize that to stand up for somebody or to amplify an issue. So the term privilege has a lot of negativity around it when it's approached initially, but I think when that foundational work is done and that scaffolding is in place for people to understand where that term comes from and how it can be utilized in an action-orientated way, it's a really powerful term. And then we come to the language of looking at experiences of harm. And it's really important for us to think about that as the experiences of harm. So when we look at terms like Islamophobia, for example, that's not a term that I use when I'm doing training sessions. Instead, I use the language of anti-Muslim hate, purely because the term Islamophobia itself, when you talk about phobia, what you're referring to is an irrational fear of something. And again, that places the focus on the individual. But when you refer to something as anti-Muslim hate or anti-Jewish hate, what you're explaining is that this is an explicit, deliberate act of discrimination or hate towards a particular community of people. When you use language that is clear and explicit in that sense, it urges organizations to consider that these are lived experiences, that these are realities, and that there should be a response to it. It's very difficult for an organization to respond to a phobia. And I think that's how we need to think about the language that we're using. And I know, Rachel, you're going to touch on anti-Semitism in more detail, but the way that I explain anti-Semitism in the work that I do as well is that there's often a misunderstanding around it, and that it's actually anti-Jewish hate. The same way that when we refer to anti-Muslim hate, anti-Jewish hate is what the term anti-Semitism means, and explaining that and giving people the understanding of what that means for those who are experiencing it through their lived experiences, but also, once again, asking organizations to localize this. What does this mean for you where you are, for your community, for the stakeholders that you have within your organization, and how can you build actions to enable a well-being and a safeguarding approach to this for those that are affected. So language is really important in terms of the clarity and the accuracy of it if we are going to translate these into action.
Thank you, Dr. Mina. That was brilliant. I certainly learned from it too. So if I tackle more of the anti-Semitism side, anti-Semitism is any hatred, bigotry, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. And as Dr. Mina explained, it basically means anti-Jewish hate, anti-Jewish racism. And I do think, as with Islamophobia, the term is really confusing. Semitism comes from the word Semitic, which is actually languages derived from the Middle East. So it's not something you can really be opposed to. And for a much more detailed definition with contemporary examples, the IHRA definition, which you can easily find online, has been adopted widely. Now, the last 7 months has seen 11 months, sorry, the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents globally since the Holocaust. And anti-Jewish racism is often referred to as the longest hatred. It actually dates back over 2,000 years to the early years of Christianity, when Jews were mistakenly blamed for the death of Christ. And what you see now with modern anti-Semitism is using lots of historic tropes. So, for example, if I was running a full session on this topic and how it relates to the workplace, I might show an image of a 13th century manuscript which depicts, I've got it in my head, a Jew with a big nose holding a bag of money. Now, numerous people have commented to me that I don't look Jewish. And in my head, I do wonder how they think I should look. And the stereotypes around Jews having power, control, and money actually stems from medieval Europe, because at that time, Jews were not allowed to own land or enter trades, and many became moneylenders because that was a trade forbidden to Christians. Now, another big issue that I see when it comes to organisations addressing Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, and be interested to hear Dr. Muna, we could maybe chat about this another time, is that despite all the progress that has been made in the DEI space, religion still seems like a taboo subject that has been left off the workplace agenda. So if you set aside what I like to call the fun, the food and the festivals that companies might raise awareness of, you know, Diwali is coming up, it's Hanukkah, it's Ramadan. But when I say religion, what words really spring to mind? And for many people, if they're being honest with themselves, religion conjures up words like extreme, ancient, irrelevant, not progressive. And I think there is a real fear. I've seen it with the organisations I've worked with for over 20 years. When it comes to this topic, they're much more hesitant and tentative. There is a real fear that talking about religion in the workplace will end up being political, divisive, offensive, polarising, having to choose one side at the expense of another. And so many companies think it is easier to just stay silent. And that's wrong. The focus needs to be on education and understanding people. And it is not as simple as acknowledging festivals in your shared company calendar, providing halal or kosher food, and accommodating a space for prayer. And the other added layer of complexity when you use the word religion for my community is that for many Jews, religious practice has absolutely nothing to do with being Jewish. If you are born, you are Jewish if your mother is Jewish, even if you choose to be an atheist. And I know plenty of Jewish people who are atheists. It's a deeply ingrained identity. So when you talk about anti-Jewish hatred, it's not against a faith, but it's a people, an ethnicity, a culture, a nationality, a heritage. And when it comes to all religions, there is considerable misunderstanding, misconception, stereotyping, and prejudice. And that's undoubtedly going to filter through to the workplace. And I myself have only been reflecting properly around this the last year on how we address religion in the workplace. And that's really why I'd rather be talking about the joys of raising children or integrating work and family. But I feel a genuine responsibility based on everything else I understand around culture and inclusion, which is work I've been engaged in for decades, whether that's parents, LGBT+ community, neurodiversity, mental health. That's why I feel this responsibility to run sessions on the language we use, understanding anti-Semitism and the Jewish lived experience.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Dr. Muna, as well. I think we've started to get into exactly what I wanted to talk about next, which is, I think, a question on a lot of our members' firms' minds. So what should we do? You know, these crises have given a lot of firms time to pause and reflect, think about how we've responded well and what we could do better. And ultimately, asset management's a people business, and the way we respond to crises matters more than ever to our employees. So we've got a wealth of experience and knowledge on this panel, and I'd like to ask each of you what key themes you'd recommend organizations to focus on when trying to build stronger communities and put their values into action. And I'd like to start with Dr. Shafii, please.
Thank you very much, Lucas. First of all, Helena and the Diversity Project team, thank you for your kind invitation to speak today. I'm honoured to speak after the first panel and also alongside my distinguished co-panelists, Fudia, Rachel and Dr. Muna. And thank you to the audience for your attendance. I hope that we can leave you with some valuable insights and some practical suggestions. So I want to open by considering a question which some people may ask, which is why are events in society, such as a rise in racism, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate, or anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hate, which affect all of us to different degrees, relevant to the workplace at all? Do we need to address these issues in the workplace? And secondly, financial institutions are businesses and their primary aim is to make money. Is there really a compelling need to incur costs to address these societal issues? Now, I know, of course, we've heard some very, very compelling anecdotes earlier today, but I want to set up the question in a way so that I can respond to it. And in response, I want to present before you the following 4 arguments. So my first point, which I want to leave with participants for reflection, is that social disorder can expose or give rise to deep vulnerability. What I mean by that is that societal events can undermine your sense of belonging or your basic sense of safety and security. Many of you will recall that these factors form the base of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Issues such as abuse or alienation may also be encountered on your way to or from work. We've heard graphic examples of that today. A journey undertaken specifically to fulfill obligations to the employing organization. And of course, issues and attitudes prevalent in society and the media may also manifest in an organizational workforce at work. In all of these circumstances, I believe it is unrealistic to expect that a person should simply turn up and perform at work unaffected by societal events. The second argument that I would like to put before you is that engagement, the very act of reaching out and having a dialogue, is very powerful and overcomes many of the harmful effects of a do-nothing approach, something which has been alluded to by my co-panelists today. This is for a number of reasons. Firstly, it validates unprocessed feelings. This allows employees to feel heard and valued and to move on, and that enhances their productivity. It also prevents rumination. It prevents the employee from going over the distressing events or incidents over and over again in their mind, which can cause severe anxiety and low mood, affecting mental health. Having a dialogue and reaching out also affirms the duty of care and the relationship between the organization and the employee, which may be undermined by a failure to engage, and this in turn then, reaching out, boosts staff morale and loyalty. Not engaging with sensitive issues is not a default position, which unfortunately has become for many organizations, but it is an active, detrimental choice. And the sensitivity of issues should not preclude people from having a dialogue, for example, because sensitive issues can still be addressed, for example, through safe space sessions and employee surveys, leveraging independent practitioners where appropriate to collect anonymized data, have confidential conversations, and inform the senior leadership team. The third argument I want to put before you is that relationships have cycles. So in mediation, we talk about cycles of engagement in relationships. Negative behaviors by one party, such as an organization or its employee, can cause resentment and engender negative behaviors in the future from the other party, resulting in long-term escalation of conflicts. Conversely, dialogue, training programs, networking, and education events, modeling of positive behaviors by the senior leadership team and managers can disrupt negative cycles and promote virtuous cycles of engagement, which will yield results over time. And so my last point on that is have a long-term outlook rather than expecting instant solutions. And I know that a number of people have raised the point today that people have been seen to do things in the short term, but not to follow through. So really, I would encourage people to take a long-term view regarding the initiatives that they take and to build their organizations over time. On that note, my last point, the fourth proposition I want to put before you really, is that the culture must be built proactively. What I mean by that is that drawing on your corporate values and implementing training programs proactively means that you are building the culture that you want. You may even wish, for example, to involve employees in outlining and agreeing their mutual responsibilities to each other quite explicitly, what I would term a corporate citizenship charter. And whilst events around you may provide an imperative for short-term actions, if you only react when events occur, you are likely to be dealing with a limited set of issues in an often polarized environment. In other words, your organization is being shaped by events and not by you. Thank you very much.
I don't know if others like me were furiously taking notes with those 4 points, but thankfully this is recorded. So I'm sure you'll have an ability to access it later. Thank you, Dr. Shafee. Fadia, let's go to you. What key theme or themes would you recommend organizations focus on?
Yes, just building on from the excellent summary that Dr. Shafi gave, I think the number one point would be is that DEI has to be a business imperative. It cannot be the thing that is relied upon by those from minoritized groups to take the lead on. It can't be reactive. So every time there's a world event, suddenly an organization is scrambling to get a message out. People need to have this as part of their KPI. Because if you see it as part of your business in which you're going to be judged on for bonuses, promotions, etc., then you will be forward thinking about it and it'll become embedded in all of your work processes. I loved the point that Dr. Shafi made about having a charter. I was going to say there needs to also be something there that people can have respectful conversation. Because as an employment lawyer, I see it when these conversations go wrong. So as much as I want to encourage curiosity and I want to encourage people having frank discussions, there is a legislative framework where if those conversations are not handled appropriately and carefully, it does expose risk. So I do think it is important that managers and all staff are trained on how to have these difficult conversations and that people can also take stock. I loved the fact that Faisal said that it took him a few months before he felt able to have that discussion with his manager, because the conversation earlier when both people may have been emotional, it has led to a very negative conversation. And this is again where EQ is important. That, you know, there's a time when people are ready and receptive to have a conversation, and there are times where people need to be able to collectively heal or digest what is going on. So I think it's also important that when we talk about bringing your authentic self, I always put a little asterisk and say authentic work self, because in a workplace we have to accept that people will have very strong different views, and therefore we need to know how to engage in those conversations in a way that remains respectful. So it's not that I'm dismissing the importance of openness and transparency. With everything in life, there need to be boundaries, and particularly as we are moving into a world where, you know, 20 years ago, people didn't have to have this skill set. There still is a very important education piece while people are unlearning. I always say I do DEI work day in, day out. I am not a finished product. I have been listening as much as I've been speaking today because I'm still on a journey. And organizations need to be from top down saying that to people. We are on a journey. Where we get things wrong, we need to be able to get real-time feedback, whether it be through anonymous or affinity groups or however, managers speaking to their staff about it. But we only get all of these rich data when we embed this into our culture, into our systems, and into our organization.
Very helpful. Thank you. Dr. Muna, let's go to you. What key theme would you recommend organizations focus on?
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Dr. Shafi and Fadia. I've been mentally taking notes of everything that you've been saying because it resonates so much with some of the points that I'm going to make as well. And I think first and foremost, I'm going to return back to the issue of language. There has to be shared literacy in an organization. If you're going to commit to engaging in this work and creating a community within your organization, then the language has to be shared and understood throughout the organization rather than being top down. That means there needs to be space for people to unpack what the terms are that are being used, to be able to articulate and explain what that means within the context of the organization as well. So it's not an abstract term that people are just floating around with. It actually has a real life explanation and an understanding at a very local level for everybody within the organization. And that language then needs to appear in all documents and in all communications throughout the organization every time that issues are being raised and issues are being communicated. And it needs to be embedded, exactly as you said, Fadia, is commitments need to be embedded in the organization. And what do we mean by that? It's one thing for an organization to say that they commit to particular values. It's another thing for employees within that organization to see those commitments put into the policies and the procedures that are embedded within the everyday practice of being in that space. So if we look at the harassment policy, for example, very few organizations have a clause in their harassment policy that articulates what microaggressions are or identifies microaggression as a form of harassment. If that language isn't there, how do you expect employees within your organization to report those experiences? How do you enable them to report those experiences? So again, it's one thing humanizing the space and creating safe spaces for people to come together to share their experiences and to support one another. But you also want to formalize that and have it within the systems and the procedures within the organization, so that there's a reference point for everybody in that organization who's able to say, this is what I'm experiencing, and I know how the organization is going to support me in reporting what I'm experiencing at the moment. So having that shared literacy, making sure that that language is then embedded in the policies and in the procedures within the organization. And then finally, focusing on compassionate leadership. So what I mean by compassionate leadership is not just looking at a result-based approach to leadership where we're saying we need the numbers to show that there's an improvement. We're looking at tangible outputs. We also need leadership that is focusing on the duty of care to their staff. What does that mean? How are you as a leader enabling your staff to feel as though they can come to you with issues, or come to anybody that's in a management role within your organization and know that they will be heard, that their experiences will be valued and will be respected within that space as well in practice? And that comes with training. For anybody that has a management or a line management role, there has to be cultural competency training, there has to be EDI training, in order to enable those individuals to build those soft skills that we think should have within those roles that they often don't have. So sometimes we would work with managers and line managers in particular who would say, I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. I'm worried about doing the wrong thing when supporting staff. And again, that comes back to the lack of literacy. If there's language that they can engage with and they know that that language is shared with the employees that they're working with, everybody feels safer having those conversations, and those conversations become more meaningful as well. So I know it seems like I talk about language all the time, but it really is at the core of all the work that we do. Once that language is clear and it's accurate, you see how easily people come into conversation with one another and build community.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Muna. Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, it's hard to find out after all this brilliant advice, and I actually really love everyone's, but Dr. Shafi's structured way of laying it out and thinking was so helpful. So I guess when you hear some similar things but in different ways, it lands. So what I feel is the biggest piece is the inclusion and belonging. So in most organisations today, there is thankfully more of a narrative around fostering this culture of authentic inclusion, valuing difference, bringing yourself whole self to work. But I have spoken to a lot of people over recent months in the workplace across all sectors, at all levels of seniority, even up to CEOs, who are not confident doing that. So for Black, Brown, Muslim, Jewish people, we may feel a real pit in our stomach, a knot in our throats, a heaviness in our heads, from sometimes really realizing that in the workplace we don't always have that sense of belonging. And it's mentally draining to fear judgment and exclusion at work. I mean, if you take me as an example, 2 decades of being utterly immersed in the world of DEI before it was a term, and I had never uttered until last year in a work context that I was Jewish. But it's something I practice every day and is a fundamental part of my identity. And I'm aware that I could hide that behind my white skin. But for example, for my community, a survey in December found almost 70% of British Jews are hiding their identity, and almost 50% have considered leaving Britain, and that includes me. And today, there is no longer a clear separation between the world outside and the company inside. It's all integrated. Now, thankfully, that means people do often feel more comfortable to share openly, but it means that the lines between work and personal are increasingly blurred. And you see that, on a professional platform like LinkedIn. But as an organisation, we cannot afford to ignore the topic of race and religion. And as someone, I can't remember who now said, if faith or race networks exist, the burden should not be placed on their members to drive the conversation. And now, even if you have no idea how many Muslim or Jewish employees there are in your organisation, if it's only one or two, you still have a duty to educate and create space for understanding, to demonstrate that you truly value and celebrate uniqueness and difference. Talking about race and religion shouldn't depend on numbers. For Jewish people, there's only 0.2 impacted. Basically, if you don't have room for difference, you have no room for humanity. And Dr. Shaffer referred to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but without the physical and psychological safety, any sense of belonging, meeting KPIs, it's just not possible. The strategy and policy without the action is just worthless. And what I think for everyone, whether you're a child, you're an adult in the workplace, whoever you are, what we all really want is to feel valued, heard, and understood. You don't need to have written a dissertation on race relations. Be human, actively listen and empathize. Helena referred to EQ right at the beginning. Be kind. And I say just, but that can be the hardest thing to do. And there's this mistaken belief we have a limited bucket of empathy. So if you provide space and empathize with one community, that doesn't mean you need to run out for another. I actually facilitated some of those sessions Faisal was referring to at Man. But keep checking in and engaging. Just say, you've been on my mind. I wish I knew what to say. And it's not a one-time thing. Be open to learning, comfortable with making mistakes, and keep referring back to your company values. All the language and parameters should already be in there. And ask yourself, what is the difference between the intent of your actions and the actual impact? Because how your intent is really received is what actually matters.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left. I would ask that those on the webcast, the audience, please continue to submit your questions via the Q&A function. We've had a few questions come in already, and so maybe I'll just direct some of these while others come in. I guess the first one broadly, and I'll direct this to Dr. Shafee, I would rephrase this as, how can organizations make sure that DEI is embraced throughout the organization? So not just leadership paying lip service to it, but that even in the middle of the organization, that DEI is embraced.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lucas. So I've obviously talked about a number of things such as safe space sessions and building, a corporate citizenship charter. These are the kind of and training and education. Obviously, these are very important programs that are rolled out throughout the organization over the long term. Getting down to some specifics, because I guess, that's what the question is really about. How does it play out on the ground? I think there are a lot of things under the radar that people underestimate the effect of. So, for example, banter around the office, the use of chat facilities and what can and can't be said on there, how people react to the news. I mean, a lot of financial services organizations have live news often playing, headlines, there's a tape going across with headlines. People react live to news events without thought to who is around them. Comments are made in meetings sometimes when you're waiting for people to arrive and people start up a conversation about something. Those and they're not informal moments, but they're perhaps moments when we're caught off guard, can sometimes do a lot of damage. So I think people need to be much more guarded and careful about how they use those moments of space. Assuming normalized opinions can often marginalize people. So making a general statement about a group of people based on something, for example, that you've just heard on the news, and it could alienate a whole group of people. And they're equal participants in the meeting, but you have just marginalized them by making a sweeping comment. And they don't feel they've got equal value at the table. So I think that's one thing we need to all be more sensitive to. We've heard obviously about cross attendance at diversity events. I think this is really important. It's something I'm quite passionate about. When I set up a diversity network, HR people used to say to me, how do you get such a diverse group of people at your events? We've never seen some of these people before. And I said, well, I go to their events. And it's quite simple, you know, that diversity is not about creating silos for different groups of people to go into and be with like-minded people. It's about putting issues on the table for everyone to benefit from, and really to permeate that exposure, that dialogue, that education throughout the organization, throughout the population. And so everybody needs to participate in all of the diversity events. It's not for specific groups. I think also social events, I think getting to know people as individuals is really important. I think it helps to break down prejudice and ignorance. And I think, you know, social events give us opportunities to do that. Again, making sure your social events are inclusive. If you find that particular groups of people don't attend because of the format or the nature of your event, you need everybody there, because it's a chance for everyone to have a voice and to get to know each other, to get to know other people and for people to know them. Line management, obviously, really important. We've heard about that again. Proactive or reactive, do something. Managers, obviously, that don't engage with issues, things fester, they escalate, they don't go away. Conversely, reaching out to someone, we've heard that the power of that today, just saying, are you okay? Is this affecting you? What can I do to help? That has value. And, you know, we don't always get things right in the way we say things, but the fact that we made the effort, the sentiment is conveyed. And we all know that when someone reaches out to us or says, you know, what can I do to help? That creates a massive amount of good feeling, and the feeling of being, you know, reassured and supported. Obviously, the involvement of HR, as we talked about, alternative channels to the management line, the involvement of HR or external independent practitioners to allow people to talk through issues in a confidential manner in a supportive environment, that can do wonders as well. So I hope these are some practical suggestions that, you know, complement some of the more systemic things that I mentioned earlier on.
Those are very
organizations.
Very helpful. Thank you. I think, Fudita, you had something you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add one very quick line, which is sometimes things have to be a 3-line party whip, because we've already talked about the fact that sometimes we're singing to the choir or preaching to the converted. Sometimes I've seen it be very productive where management say everyone is expected unless they've got a good reason not to attend, because, you know, and that's why we need leaders to be leading from the front, because it's the same way if you ever do training. If a leader hasn't got their camera on, no one's got their cameras on. The leaders aren't going to these events. People who see it as a can't be bothered, I've got work to do, are less likely to attend. So we need to try and make it as unattractive as possible for people to close their eyes and close their ears to the message. And that might be unattractive because people want to say this, you know, come to this if you're interested. But we need to get to a point where people are hearing the message.
That's excellent advice. Thank you. Another question that has come in, I thought Dr. Muna might be able to answer. It was sort of about microaggressions and how organizations should deal with, you know, the perpetrators of microaggressions. And I might even expand on that question to say, or what about, you know, where it's not micro, where it's macro, you know, where it's blatant and out in the open. What's the best way for organizations to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the times when organizations are wanting to do work that's around diversity and inclusion, the focus is on building community and how do we bring people together and about the culture of an organization. And the most important way to do that is to make sure that everybody feels that their psychological safety and that their well-being is a priority for the organization that they're a part of. And that doesn't just mean in terms of the interpersonal communications that they're having with individuals, but knowing that the organization is taking care of them. And that is really through the reporting mechanisms that are available, making sure that there are safe reporting mechanisms that are put in place so that if somebody is experiencing a microaggression, they know that there is ways in which this can be reported and that they can be supported through that. It's also really unhelpful to mark somebody that has committed a microaggression as a perpetrator, because that is a label that is sort of definitive and there is no opportunity for learning when you target somebody or when you label them as being a perpetrator of a microaggression, because the reality is there are so many things that we all don't know about the people that we work with, and there are so many times when we will have committed microaggressions against somebody else without realizing that we've done it. So we've all been perpetrators to a certain degree. I think what's really helpful in an organizational context is when an incident like this happens is to deal with that particular incident, but also think about what the learning opportunity is for the organization that can be taken from what's been experienced, because there's always some learning that can be taken away from that for the broader community within that space. So microaggressions is something that is going to consistently be an issue within an organization. And what we find is when an organization starts to use clear, accurate language and enable those reporting mechanisms, what they find is that the number of reported cases for microaggressions increases in their organization, and they become really alarmed because they think they've started a conversation and suddenly there's a rise in microaggressions that are being experienced. And the issue isn't that the number of microaggressions has increased, is that there's now a language for people to name it, and that reporting should be seen as a positive because it means they trust the system that you've created enough to report those experiences. And so it's about really not being alarmed by the fact that once that language is there, the numbers that you're looking at are going to look slightly different. It's going to be alarming at first because you're going to realize that things that weren't being reported are now being reported because there's a language for it. And now as an organization, your responsibility is, how do you account for that? How do you respond to that in a holistic way so that everybody in the organization has the opportunity to learn from it? And there's a statement that I constantly keep referring back to when I do this work is, you have to remember when you're a leader of an organization and you are trying to create inclusion within your organization, that it's not inclusion if you are inviting people into a space that you are unwilling to change. So you constantly have to be thinking about the conditions of that environment. If people do not feel included in that space, the issue is the environment itself, not the individuals within that space. So I think part of it is about depersonalizing it and thinking, what are we doing about the conditions of our environment that mean that there are some people who are consistently experiencing particular microaggressions and others who feel unable to do that without consequence.
Such a great point about tracking and reporting. Just remember, we provide a mechanism and a language, and events will go up, but that's not a negative. That's a positive. It gives us the opportunity to address. Rachel, there's a question that's come in that I'd like to direct to you, please. Briefly, I guess, because we're running low on time. Yeah, I'm getting the finish things up sign from Helena. But last question, if I may, most organizations are secular, right? I mean, we're talking about corporations or not-for-profits. So how do they comment publicly on religious or faith-based issues? Like, what's your advice?
I mean, we have talked quite a lot about religion and approaching and everything. There's so many nuanced variables that we've seen after recent event. Do we make a statement? Is it public? Is it internal? Who do we check it with? Everything else. And what I also understood around this, it depends where employees are based, which regions, where your main clients and suppliers are based. So as the first panel described, there's no point thinking I've made the statement, it's great, I've done my bit, and then that kind of okay, and everyone's disappeared, and now what? So I think there's the statement thing created, especially after events in the Middle East, a lot of complexities and problems, but actually some of those challenges are still there, and we need to continue to be talking about them.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, as we always say with these kinds of conversations, like, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And so I recognize that several questions have come in that we've not had the opportunity to answer. I suspect as folks reflect on the information that was provided today, that they'll have even more questions and want to follow up. And I imagine Helen is going to provide us some perspective on how that might happen. But before I turn it back over to Helena, I did just want to give a massive thank you to Fudia, Dr. Shafii, Dr. Muna, and Rachel for your incredible insights, for participating and providing your perspective, and just for your engagements on some really important issues. So thank you.
Well, add my thanks to this wonderful panel, and also obviously again to Daniel, Faisal and Stephen, and of course to you, Lucas. Thank you so much for such expert chairing. Yes, I appreciate we ran out of time, so thank you for the massive interest in this topic and also the slew of questions. What we will do is we'll make a note of all the questions and the person who's asked them and attempt to get back to everybody in some way, shape or form, probably by email, but or else signposting you to a source for the answers. So we will also take all of the inputs and some of the themes that have arisen today on board as we compile what will be, as I said at the start, a sort of first attempt at a guide for firms and for colleagues in terms of helping to deepen our understanding of each other and to deal with some of these very tricky issues. There are so many amazing takeaways from everything that's been said. I'm just going to capture or repeat a couple of them. Dr. Shafi had talked about diversity is not about getting like-minded people together and all agreeing with each other. And of course, I might say, well, that's the whole point of diversity, but I think it does get forgotten about quite often. And it's very important to remember. And this idea that I hope that we have conveyed today of listening to each other, of asking questions of each other, of discussing things openly and listening to each other, developing our empathy and understanding of each other's faiths, backgrounds, other aspects about our colleagues that we might have felt, they might not be interested in us on sharing with us, but actually do enhance our compassion and our humanity. And I just want to emphasize again the point that was made so well earlier by Faisal and Stephen, that we have so much more in common with each other as human beings than we have differences. And sometimes it can feel that all of these divisions and differences are greatly separating us. Today is, I hope, the start of a very conscious effort on the part of many people to overcome those differences. There's been a lot of talk about the benefits of diversity and particularly sort of different experiences, cognitive diversity. So I just wanted to draw your attention to something else that the Diversity Project is leading on, and that is we are commissioning a piece of academic research to really look at and explore, without prejudging the outcome, the linkage, if any, between cognitive diversity and the performance of investment teams. A lot of data is cited, quoted very freely about that linkage, but actually, as we've seen in the States in particular, the research on which that's based is not that robust necessarily and is open to criticism around methodology, and there's certainly nothing that I'm aware of that actually links it with investment performance. So watch this space for that. The deadline for submissions from academics, and we have had interest from around the world, has been extended to the end of this month. A couple of people needed a bit of extra time because of holidays. But I hope that it will build upon what's been discussed this morning. And if you know of anybody who would be interested in that, then please do point them in the direction. I think Adriana's just put that in the chat. So it's not something we're asking firms to get involved with just yet, but we will be looking for case studies once the researcher is appointed and gets going with their work. So just stealing a moment at the end to highlight that. I do want to thank everybody who's joined us today, because I think it shows great intent for us to improve and to improve our mutual understanding. So thank you for your interest, and please don't hesitate to follow up with us. We will, as I say, be following up with you, either if you've asked questions or just because we'll be publishing a short guide that would hopefully then become a longer one illustrated by case studies. So thank you again for your time and attention and interest in this topic. And I look forward to seeing you at another Diversity Project event quite soon. Thank you so much, and goodbye.